The crossover, bridging gaps between Jews and Christians. In these days of violent religious and ethnic conflict, the judeo-Christian foundations of our country need to be strengthened by uniting Jews and Christians on their commonalities and with their God. The crossover brings intriguing, dramatic testimonies and timely topics with a variety of guests discussing the Bible, fact or fiction, the Hebraic roots of Christianity, Judaism 101, the Promised Land, Creed and Deed, the Feasts of the Lord, and never forget, stories of Jewish and Christian martyrs and their liberators past and present.
I live by the telephone. It's how I communicate with everybody. And so if my telephone goes out, I'm very upset. One day my telephone went dead, and I was livid. I ran to the manager's office in my apartment complex looking to use a telephone so that I could call the telephone company. And when I got there, sitting at the table was my neighbor, Wanda. I think her name was really Wanda, but it always sounded like Wanda when she said it. And I kind of knew Wanda. She parked in the parking space right next to me in the parking lot. And we never really exchanged too many words. She was an older woman who had an accent. And whenever I tried to help her with groceries or things like that, she wouldn't accept my help. She always wanted to do things on her own. But this day, she was sitting at a table with a letter in her hand, and her hand was shaking. And I did not want to be bothered with anything. I wanted to make my phone call. I wanted to find the phone company, but there was Wanda just holding this letter and shaking. I asked her, "What's wrong?" And she said, "Look what they give me. Look what they give me." And in her hand was a letter from the apartment complex. It was an eviction notice, giving her 3 days to move out for non-payment of rent. "I pay my rent," she said. "I paid 2 months in advance, so this does not happen. Why do they give me this letter?" And I said, would you like me to wait and talk to the manager with you?" She said, "I speak good English, except when I'm nervous." And so I waited with her, and we spoke to the manager, who apologized and said it must be a clerical error, and said that if she could find her canceled checks, it would help. It would help. And so I went back with Wanda to her apartment. And there in her apartment was beautifully decorated with lots of pictures of Jesus and Mary and crosses and crucifixions and all kinds of religious symbols. And Wanda clearly was a very religious Catholic. She asked me what I did for a living, and I told her I'm a religious leader of a Jewish synagogue. And she smiled and she said, "It's all one God. It's all one God." And she gave me a cup of tea, and we sat and talked for a little bit. And she told me that she was from Poland. And I asked her if she was there during the war and if she knew about the concentration camps. And she said, "You know, it was not only Jews. I was in a camp too." She told me about the labor camp she had been in. She had been an orphan and had always wanted to have a mother, but she had to work in the camp. And we exchanged stories. And she told me a little bit about her faith and a little bit about how she came to America. And I asked her, "Can you tell me about a miracle?" She said, "Oh, I have many miracles I've seen, but I'll tell you the most recent. I was in a department store. I was dressed like nothing, a sweatpants and a sweatshirt, no makeup, and I'm walking down the steps. And as I'm walking, I feel something on my elbow. And I look up, and there is a man helping me walk down the steps. Why is he helping me? I can walk. I am not a cripple. And I am not looking nice. I'm wearing a sweatpants and a sweatshirt. But I look at this man, and he is dressed. He is dressed with more class than I have ever seen, a very nice suit, a very nice hat. And he is helping me down the steps. Why is he helping me? We get to the bottom, and he tips his hat. He smiles and goes. Why did he help me? That's a miracle. And I looked at her. I smiled and I said, Wanda, you know how many people wouldn't think twice about something like that? The miracle is how you noticed. And look at us, how we've come together just to have this nice visit. She smiled at me and said, you think God didn't turn off your telephone?
Shalom, and welcome to our show, The Crossover, a show aimed at bridging gaps between Jews and Christians. Today we have a very special guest on our show, Dan Gordon. He is the rabbinic spiritual leader of Temple Beth Torah from Humble, Texas. He's also a Magid, or a sacred storyteller. He has received several awards for enthralling audiences of all ages and backgrounds in storytelling. Here is Mitch and Dan. Enjoy.
Dan, welcome to our show, The Crossover.
Hi, Mitch. Glad to be here.
Glad to have you as a guest. Let's start off here, Dan. We're living in a world where a lot of Jewish people don't even practice their religion anymore or adhere to it. And you have embraced it to the level that you're not only a spiritual leader, but you also travel internationally and are a storyteller. And what is it that enabled you to embrace your roots, your Jewish roots, with such a fervent?
Well, I think for the people who don't feel very connected to Judaism, that something happened along the way in which they perhaps got turned off about something maybe at a young age. Unfortunately, a lot of young people who study Judaism stop at the age of 13 for the bar or bat mitzvah. And that's when sophisticated Jewish learning can really start. Where I enjoyed being Jewish a lot was in the camaraderie I had in youth groups and at summer camp. And that became my life. And it was the singing and the music and the dancing and the praying together as a community. And I think I just found that my friends were Jewish and that there was a community of people that I could bond with.
So when you were younger, the arts came alive for you, it sounds like, for the Jewish roots.
The arts were a big part of it, yes.
And it brought you more into the religious end of it. So then explain this too, Dan, the term Magid?
Magid.
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 And you are one. And what does that mean?
Yes, a Magid is one who shares sacred stories. And that's what a storyteller is. It's a Magid, but someone who's telling stories for the purpose of teaching, for the purpose of inspiring other people. As I mentioned, the summer camp experience, as I was a child, that turned into, for me professionally, becoming a camp director. I was originally a drama major in college, and that's where the performance aspect really came to light. But I enjoyed working with children, and so I directed plays at summer camp and worked at after-school programs. And then professionally, I became a camp director and found that telling stories both to children and to the counselors was a teaching tool. And I would find that storytelling was what really drew people together.
Doesn't matter what the age.
It doesn't matter what the age. And today I really find a lot of work with senior citizens especially. Senior citizens are especially eager for storytelling. I also spend some time going to prisons and sharing stories with inmates at prisons. And I'll tell you, I don't have any more appreciative audience than the inmates who are looking for a way of not just entertaining themselves, but to really learn how to survive in the enclosed society that they're in and learn how they may be able to function in society when they get out.
And here you're reaching an audience, obviously it's not just Jewish, but of all denominations in the prison.
Well, actually, I do mostly my work with the Jewish inmates, but some of the inmates who have come to the Jewish programs weren't born Jewish, but have met a rabbi along the way that's encouraged them to connect with the Jewish teachings.
Well, Dan, for our audience here, what about, our show is about bridging the gaps between the Jewish people and the Christians. And can you share a story either true or not in your life that you would tell in regards to that?
Well, one of the nicest stories that I remember hearing once was about a rabbi who was teaching his students about the Havdalah service. Havdalah means a separation or a distinction, and Havdalah comes at the end of the Sabbath. It comes right at sundown, and it's a separation between the Holy Sabbath and the rest of the week. And so he was teaching them. They asked the question, when do we begin? How do we know when the day has ended and the night has begun? And the answer to that traditionally is that when 3 stars are visible in the sky.
Okay.
And so that lesson was complete, and one of the students said, but Rabbi, how do we know that when night ends and day begins? So like any good rabbi, he said to the students, "No, you tell me." And they would make guesses. One of them said, perhaps it's when you can tell the difference between a date tree and a fig tree. The rabbi said, that's not the answer. Another said, perhaps it's the difference when you can see the difference between a lamb and a goat. And he said, that's not the answer either. And they kept on making guesses, and finally the student who asked the question said, you tell us, Rabbi, when is it that night ends and day begins? And the rabbi said, when you can look into the eyes of a stranger and see your brother or your sister. Until then, it will always be dark for us. And so perhaps the message in that story is, regardless of the theology, that we are brothers and sisters, and that we need to look at each other in that way.
Yeah, that's great. So let's talk about your storytelling, Dan. That was a great example to get a lesson and hold our attention, right, without using Scripture, Torah, whatever. What about your role now also as a spiritual leader? So you have this side of you that is the teacher through the stories, but you're also not a rabbi, if I'm correct, but a spiritual leader of a synagogue.
Well, and they're pretty much similar terms. Rabbi means teacher. It's also become sort of an educational distinction, and so because I haven't completed seminary studies, I don't use the title rabbi. But the synagogue, Temple Beth Torah, has asked me to be their teacher, their rabbinic leader, if you will. And this came about through storytelling. When I was telling stories throughout Houston, I came to them one Shabbat evening and did some storytelling at one of their regular services. And about a year later, when they were between rabbis, sort of, they called me up and said, we liked your stories, can you do the other stuff too? And so I came and became their teacher, and I've been learning along the way. How I incorporate it is in just about every capacity of congregational leadership. Certainly in pastoral counseling. When people come for advice, there's always stories to tell about situations that can help them. Often the stories are personal stories of things that have happened in my life, and sometimes they're traditional folklore like the one I just shared. What I do at our worship services is I try and find a link between the stories that the Torah is telling and stories that I know. And very often it happens that there's a particular folk tale or even something that's happened in my life. I think since I've been working in this capacity, I've had an unusual opportunity to really look at recognizing the sacred in the ordinary. That very often something will happen to me and I'll be looking for it, whereas it might have happened years ago and I might not have noticed. That one of the most sacred things is to notice when something sacred happens in your life. I'm working on a book now that I am not very far along on yet, called The Unlikely Elijahs. And Elijah was a prophet who, as legend has it, did not die, but rode to heaven on a chariot. And so we have many legends that talk about Elijah coming to earth, and that Elijah will be the prelude to the days of the Messiah, and that Elijah travels the earth in disguise, and that when Elijah sees that we're ready for a messianic age, that will be the time that the Messiah will come. And so I've had a number of incidences in my own life in which somebody would appear, and then after the encounter, I'd be thinking, could that be?
So Dan, carry forth on that. Give what would be Elijah's story?
Well, for instance, one of the times when Elijah is supposed to come is during the Passover Seder. And there was one night when I was hosting a very large Passover Seder, and I had rented a clubhouse and invited all my friends and neighbors, lots of Jews, non-Jews, African Americans, every different faith, and it was a big, tumultuous event, and there was a sign on the door of the clubhouse that said, "The annual, let all who are hungry come and eat Seder." Because that's one of the lines that we say in the Passover Seder, let all who are hungry come and eat. And a gentleman walked in a brown terry cloth bathrobe that was almost closed, and bedroom slippers, and about a 2 days growth of beard, and walked in and said, "What's going on here?" And I said, "Well, this is the Passover feast. Welcome and come and enjoy, and we've got a ceremony and then some food." And he said, "What's going on here?" And one of my friends said, "Dan, why don't you just start the service?" And she got up and spoke to him for a little bit and disappeared. And about an hour and a half later, she came back and said that he was lonely. And she fixed him a plate and went back to his apartment and sat and ate with him. And who knows? One of the things the Talmud teaches us about the Messiah's age is that if we expect that the Messiah has come by in disguise, and we treat each person we meet as if that person just might be the Messiah in disguise, then if the Messiah's identity is not revealed during our lifetime, it won't matter.
Right. Treat everyone that way. Well, Dan, what else do you do as a spiritual leader?
Well, I do a lot of teaching. I teach in an adult education program at the Jewish Community Center called the Florence Melton Adult Mini School, which is a national program of adult learners who go through a 2-year program of learning 4 different courses related to Judaism, and then after 2 years of that, they have the option of continuing in more courses.
What would those courses be?
The core courses include Purposes of Jewish Living, Rhythms of Jewish Living, which is about holidays and the calendar and life cycles, Ethics, and Dramas, which is a history course.
And are these mainly attained by husband and wife, or mainly just one spouse, or?
It's a complete mixture, and it's a mixture of ages too. Young people in their 20s, a lot of retirees, often a husband and wife together, and we've got many people who've kept going for 8, 9 years. Every year they ask the instructors to come up with a new course because there are people who are interested in taking something new. So I also teach a course in Midrash, which is Jewish folklore.
Oh.
I also travel to other communities that don't have rabbis. Particularly, there's a community in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, that I go to a few times a year. And I spend a weekend there and I do some adult teaching.
So is it more like a cell group of people that just come together and then once in a while a spiritual leader or rabbi pops in on them?
Well, it's called a chavarah, which means a friendship group. And it's an actual organization and a congregation, but they don't have enough people to maintain a weekly presence, and so they gather once a month.
Okay. And what about your connection, obviously, to the Jewish families is primary, but what about also in this day and age with Christians? Apparently you have some connection there. Why don't you share that?
Well, periodically I'm asked to speak at different churches about Judaism and to help people understand some of the differences and some of the roots where Christianity started. We also have in our synagogue a number of the Jewish members are married to non-Jewish people. And so there's a great sensitivity in our teaching because we want to be respectful of everybody, and we make a great effort to make everyone who comes to the temple feel comfortable, that a non-Jewish spouse can come and worship and be part of a Jewish family, even if that's not their personal theology.
And Dan, let's hop to the other side there for a minute. When you go to a church to share what you share, are a lot of the churches, is it kind of a new awakening to even realize that Christianity's roots are in the Hebraic roots, that it would be no Christianity without it?
Sometimes
Jewishness?
it is. Sometimes it is. There's a number of times we'll get a call from a group that wants to come and visit the temple and see where it is. And when I've attended different churches, even seeing part of the worship service that has been a tradition that may have been borrowed from Judaism is always very intriguing to me, whether it's a line of scripture or a particular ritual. But there you find that just in Judaism and Christianity, there are a lot of Jewish people who don't know much about Judaism. There are a lot of Christian people who don't know much about Christianity. And the more people learn about themselves, the more they can understand the other.
Right. Well, they have the same God, the God of Abraham,
Absolutely.
Isaac, and Jacob there. Dan, so a lot of our show, or we have a part of our show called Judaism 101. It's to educate the Christians that their roots are Hebraic and to also reach out to the Jewish people that have left their roots or become agnostic to get reignited to the Jewish faith. And what would you say, if you had, you're speaking to a Christian audience right now, which is obviously a larger audience, what would you like to say to them is the most important thing that they should know about the Jewish roots or about Israel, about Judaism? What would be the most important?
Well, I think in connecting with the Jewish community, perhaps one of the most important things to remember is that Jews don't feel incomplete, that we don't feel a lacking because we have not become Christian, that there's enough in Judaism for us to embrace, and that this is the roots of our belief, and that our lives are not incomplete because we haven't taken another step, that Judaism is a complete, full religion and a complete, full faith, that our community helps bring us together and helps us worship together and support one another.
Okay. And let's flip it around the other way. What would you say here to the Jewish community that has maybe fallen from their Hebraic roots and don't even practice anymore, become agnostic, or don't even believe anything anymore? What would you like to say to them right now about Judaism?
Well, once again, it's hard for me to answer a question like that without telling a short story.
Please.
And it reminds me, this is actually isn't a Jewish story, though. It's an Indian story,
Okay.
and a Sufi story. It's the very popular folk tale about 7 blind men who encounter an elephant. And each of the men comes to the elephant and touch part of it, and they all come back to compare notes to decide what the elephant was like. And one of them says, an elephant is like a big flat wall. And the other one says, no, an elephant is like a stringy rope. And another one says, no, an elephant is big and round like a tree trunk. And each of them had touched a different part of the elephant. And one of the wise elders, who was also blind, said, don't you see? You've only touched part of it. So what I would say to the Jews who have not been embracing their Judaism is, touch part of it. Judaism is a big elephant. It's got lots of different aspects. It's got a culture with food and music and dance. It's got a community with camaraderie and fellowship. It's got opportunities for social justice and being able to work and community service and helping other people. And that a lot of people who have embraced other things in their lives, whether it's another faith or political cause, might just be able to find the roots of what they're already embracing in Judaism.
So Dan, real life scenario, I know in your synagogue you've got mixed marriages. How do you deal with that? How do you reach out to the Jewish husband who's not practicing his Judaism anymore, who's married to a Christian woman who's on fire for her religion? And what do you say to him to try to even bring him back to his roots?
Well, very often Judaism, as opposed to some other faiths, is much more about questions than it is about answers. In fact, there's a popular joke that says, why does a Jew always answer a question with a question? And the answer, of course, is, why shouldn't a Jew always answer a question with a question? And so, different than some religious leaders, I don't really feel like I can tell someone what to believe or how to feel. What I do, rather than that, is try and create an atmosphere in which there's a comfort, in which where both the husband and the wife and the children are happy to be there and want to be there. And then they have to make up their own decisions. The only control I have is to make an atmosphere and an environment that's going to be appealing to everybody.
And we would hope that they would want to be there and get enriched in their lives. Dan, with all the intermarriages in your synagogue, share with us a success story that you've had.
Sure. Very often there's some difficulty because people coming from different faiths definitely have different viewpoints. But once they've decided to affiliate, and once they've decided to be part of a synagogue, then our goal is to help them feel comfortable. Mostly it's a matter of the husband and wife really communicating with each other and showing respect for where each of them is coming from. We had one couple in which they've been married for over 20 years now. And when they first got married, the Catholic man was certain that the children were going to be raised Catholic. When the children were born, the wife changed her mind. And they had a lot of conflict at first. And then he went to Mass and prayed for an answer. And very heartfully told me this story. And he decided that it wasn't about winning an argument. It wasn't about his side winning. It was about his family being able to pray together. And he realized that when they go to the temple, that in a Jewish service they don't say anything that contradicts his Catholicism. And when they went to church, they did do things that contradicted his wife's Judaism. So he didn't relinquish his own religion, and he's a faithful churchgoer every Sunday. But Friday nights, he and his family are in the temple because that's where they decided they could pray together.
What percent would you say of the congregants are in that situation of mixed marriage?
No place is typical. Our temple, though, has roughly half of the families have one Jewish partner and one non-Jewish partner.
Well, Dan, we're out of time, and we sure appreciate you being able to come and share with us, and hopefully we'll do this again.
Terrific.
You
Thanks,
have a
Mitch.
great day.
Pleasure. Shalom.
Shalom.
We hope that you enjoyed our program today at the Crossover and this wonderful show with Dan Gordon, The Tales of a Wandering Jew. We will be having more of his tales on future shows. And for those of you who want more information about him or about this show, you can contact us at the Crossover at earthlink.net, or you can contact Dan at the synagogue, www.templebethtorah.org. Shalom, and thanks for staying tuned.
The Crossover, an award-winning program bridging gaps between Jews and Christians. For your comments, more information on today's or other Crossover programs, or if you would like to support this effort, contact us at 713-639-2888 or www.thecrossover.tv. We want to hear from you.